Hello and welcome back to episode 8 of Charlie.inkspired. How are you guys this week? I myself am plodding along, trying to survive the year that is 2024. It's been an interesting start. Little update from me, I have 2 gigs coming up in April. So on the 13th and 14th of April I am performing. So on the 13th I am in Suburbia in Southampton. And the 14th I'm at Exchange in Bristol. I've played at Exchange before, an awesome venue. Always such a good crowd in Bristol. The alternative scene is really good there. Never played in Southampton, so if you are from the south of England or the west of England and you want to come see me live, you want to come have a chat, you want to see my music, then yes, absolutely please do come down and say hi and tell me where you came from, like where you found my music and stuff. I'd really love that. It would make me really happy. It would make my year, let's say. Thank you for the support on last week's video. I mentioned my last music video that came out and the issues I'm having around advertising. That's always going to be an issue because there's blood that's meant to represent menstrual blood. But if you could just go share some love in it, drop a cool comment about the song, about whatever you want. I've had some interesting comments on there. Actually, there was one from a woman. They claimed they were a woman and they said, like, this is disgusting. They slated literally everything about it, but they completely missed the topic of the music video. So yeah, if the fact that a woman's menstrual blood is more offending to you than the topic of the song and what the song is trying to present an issue in the world of, then I think you really need to go take a step back and maybe reassess your priorities of what offends you. But yeah, so if you want to share some love to overcome that, that would be great. I have been deep into Married at First Sight Australia. The Australians just do it better and I won't hear any less. Every year that it comes out, it's just so good, but this year it's juicy. And finally, another quick shout out is Broken Spirit Apparel are launching their business, their clothing brand, and they very kindly sent me this t-shirt. So yeah, massive shout out to them. Make sure you go follow them on TikTok, Instagram. They are launching at the end of this month, so make sure you get a t-shirt, come match with me, get the Broken Spirit tee. It's such good quality. There's a print on the back as well. But yeah, make sure you go send them some love because you know what? I really love wearing things that look like band merch that aren't band merch. Like I'll always wear band merch because obviously I'm a musician and I want to support my fellow musicians, but there's nothing worse than being an alternative female and being out in the public and everyone's like, oh yeah, you're a fan of that band, name 5 songs or name all of their albums. And it's just like, just let me enjoy the music I want to enjoy and wear what I want to wear. Okay? Is that okay? Whereas like clothing like this that is meant to represent the heavy music scene or the alternative community, you can wear it and just not have to worry about questions like that because you can just be like, oh, it's actually a clothing brand. So yeah, actually a clothing brand called Broken Spirit Apparel, so make sure you go send them some love. This week we're going to cover a case that changed the shape of the UK. It kind of forced uneducated members of society to open their eyes and wake up to the racism that is very much present in today's society. And this case is 30 years old, so it still, I think, teaches us some very important lessons today. And it's probably one of the most infamous cases of the UK. Like, this case happened before my time, but I am very aware of how much it shook London, the UK, and people's awareness of racism in the police. But before we get started, I want to get into my usual disclaimer. I do not mean any harm nor disrespect to the families or victims involved in today's case. These episodes are researched by myself and myself only, compiled with evidence that is already available online. I do like to put my opinions into my episodes, so please bear that in mind. You do not have to agree with them. However, as you are entitled to yours, I'm also entitled to mine. Lastly, today's case covers topics of violence, blood, murder, racism. So it's a really heavy one. So if you're not in the mood for that today, that's okay. Pause now and come back when you are feeling in a better place to hear it. With that being said, let's take a breath in and out. Okay, let's begin. We're going to start with the heart and soul of this case today. Stephen Lawrence. Stephen was born in Greenwich District Hospital on the 13th of September 1974. He was the youngest of 3 siblings. He had a younger brother called Stuart and a younger sister called Georgina. Stephen was born to his Jamaican parents who emigrated to the UK in the 60s. His father Neville was a carpenter and his mother Doreen was a special educational needs teacher. Stephen and his family lived in South East London and they were really close-knit. They were very happy together and they loved each other. Stephen was an incredible athlete and he'd often take part in local competitions, specifically for Cambridge Harriers Athletics Club. As well as his natural gift for sports, he actually had something that he was really passionate about that he knew he wanted to go on and do for the rest of his life, and that was architecture. And a random fact for this case is that in 1988, Stephen actually appeared as an extra in a film called For Queen and Country, which is a pretty big film. So yeah, it looked like he kind of had his hands in like every pot. Like he's a bit creative. He loves architecture, which is not only creative, but really, really technical. And he was also really good at sports. Stephen's friends described him as positive, upbeat, and responsible. And I want you to remember that, because the way certain people, in this case, like to try and portray this young man is very different. He was completely dedicated to his schoolwork and was always described as really gifted. Stephen was quite popular at school and surrounded by a really good group of friends, in particular his best friend, Dwayne Brooks. But sadly, that didn't stop the racism that was occurring in his school and throughout his childhood. Because throughout secondary school, Stephen would often fall victim to bullying and racist jokes. And we're in London in like the 80s, 90s, so I'm not totally surprised by that. Like, even in my time in kind of just on the outskirts of London at school in like the noughties, 2010s, racism was still rife. Does that make it okay? Absolutely not. So I imagine that it was probably quite bad, considering I witnessed it in my time on the outskirts of London. I can't imagine what it was in central London in the 80s and 90s. And it's important to bring that up because it's a huge running theme throughout this case, but I also think that going through these experiences in secondary school actually taught Stephen that the world is not exactly as fair as it should be. He very quickly came to the realization that England is racist. And this awful, hard-hitting truth really pushed Stephen to want to make a difference in the world. And he actually became really fascinated with racism in minority communities. And he even began attending protests about racism and racist murders that occurred in London. And in 1991, he attended a protest following the murder of 15-year-old Roland Adams. Safe to say his parents were a little uneasy about him attending these, in fears that he would bring attention to himself or, he could be victim to an attack there, which I can totally understand. That's their child. They don't want him to be put in any dangerous situation. They're very aware of what it was like at the time. And you've also got to remember that as an older generation, they're probably thinking, let's just keep our heads down and not draw attention. And I can't blame them for feeling that way. Like, I can't imagine how they felt firsthand. Obviously, I'm white, so I'm never going to understand how they feel truly. But I remember in 2020, I attended a protest for George Floyd, or Black Lives Matter movement, following the death of George Floyd that was just going viral. And my parents were really concerned about me joining, not because they disagreed with what I was wanting to speak up about. They were totally on board with that. But granted, it was a pandemic, but also I think they were just really scared that the word protest sounds scary. They're not always peaceful, and all it takes is one bad person to kind of start a riot in a sense. So earlier we mentioned that Stephen really, really had his heart set on becoming an architect. And at Blackheath Bluecoat School, he was studying technology and physics, as well as English literature and English language at Woolwich College. That's a real mouthful. Woolwich College. Yeah, sorry. And he was working so hard to fulfill his dream. Like, he had his blinkers on. He was just like, this is what I want to do and this is what I'm going for. And I fully respect that. And he'd even completed a work placement at an architecture firm. So even at a young age, he just knew that's the path he wanted to go down, and he was going to do anything he could to get to that. But towards the end of Stephen's college days, he stopped attending church and kind of stopped spending as much time with his family and wanted to spend as much time as he could with his friends. He was less interested in studying and really wanted to just hang out and be a normal teenager. And I really think this is normal. I can't stress how common this is. I remember being at the end of college and just being so tired. You spent your whole life in education and now you are an adult. You're 18 years old. You are right at the end of teenagehood. And you're still in school. It's tough. And I remember just being like, I can't be bothered. I can't be bothered to make it through. So maybe he was feeling a bit of that. I don't know. So I can't blame him for wanting to, take a step back from the studying, take a step back from the homework and just exist peacefully. We all rebel a little bit in our college days, but Stephen wasn't rebelling. He was just being a normal kid. In 1993, Stephen was 18 by now, and he actually started dating his first girlfriend. They'd had a first date and it went really, really well. And Stephen was excited and just beaming from ear to ear, telling his friends about how well it went. They had a second date planned out and he was just really looking forward to it. This was the first girl that he'd really shown interest in or had a successful first date with, and his friends remember him being just ecstatic. On the morning of the 22nd of April 1993, Stephen had breakfast with his father in the morning as usual, and before he left for college, he promised his father he'd be home by 10:30 that night. After college that day, Stephen visited some shops in Lewisham, and then he travelled to his uncle's house in Groves Park. His best friend Dwayne, that we mentioned earlier, actually met him at his uncle's house where they played video games, hung out. They would often kind of play here because it was a bit quieter, didn't have his younger siblings around. It's just something that they like to do together, and they played games here until about 10 p.m. that night. So around 10 p.m. they wandered to the bus stop and they got on their usual 286 bus that they would normally get from Stephen's uncle's house. But as they were on this bus, they realised that it was taking a longer route and it was going to get them in quite late. And by this point, Stephen was already cutting it quite fine with his curfew, and he knew he wasn't going to make it on time, but he really wanted to try get home because he did promise his dad that he was going to be back by 10:30. So in an attempt to get home quicker, the pair decided to get off and switch to the 161 or the 122 on Well Hall Road. So they got off at Well Hall Road at around 25 minutes past 10. And the pair were patiently waiting at the bus stop, and time went by, and then before you knew it, it was 10:30, and Stephen decided to just walk down the road a little bit to see if he could see a bus coming towards the bus stop. So he walked towards the junction of Dixon Road whilst Dwayne waited back at the bus stop. As Stephen was kind of standing there searching for any oncoming buses, a group of 6 white men turned to look at Stephen. This group were on the opposite side of the road when all of a sudden they started walking towards Stephen. And Dwayne could see this group walking towards him. At around 10:38, he shouted out to Stephen to be like, "Hey, are you okay? Can you see a bus?" When suddenly this group of 6 white men started shouting racial slurs to Stephen and walking across the road quite rapidly towards him. Dwayne heard the racial slurs they were screaming at Stephen, so he shouted at his friend to run, and Dwayne started running himself. We can't blame Dwayne for running. He is also a young black male who has just seen a group of white men shouting racial slurs at his friend. If he sticks around, he's going to get hurt as well. So he shouts at Stephen to run and just legs it. Your instincts kick in. He doesn't want any trouble, he just doesn't want to get hurt. The attack on Stephen was quick and lasted anywhere between 10 and 50 seconds. So it was less than a minute. Though I'm sure to Stephen this felt like the longest minute of his life. The 6 men charged at Stephen and forced him to the ground. They stabbed him with a knife, going 5 inches into his body. He was stabbed on both sides of his torso, in the right collarbone and the left shoulder. Both of these wounds severed major arteries as well as puncturing his lung. Stephen would have immediately lost all feeling and he was losing blood rapidly. Not only that, but his breathing would be completely restricted because he literally has a hole in his lung. The gang fled down Dixon Road and Dwayne started running back to Stephen, telling him to get up and run with him. And Stephen did get up. Dwayne and Stephen managed to run 120 metres down the road before Stephen collapsed in the road, just bleeding out. The fact that he managed to run 120 metres after being stabbed twice, severing major arteries whilst having a punctured lung, only shows testimony to how physically fit or able and gifted Stephen was. Like, I couldn't do that now. Dwayne sprinted to the nearest telephone box and called for help. He got through to the ambulance and pleaded for them to arrive to save his best friend's life. And Dwayne did everything he could. He was flagging down cars, pedestrians, frantically waving his arms to anyone who would even remotely look in his direction. Dwayne managed to flag down an off-duty police officer who covered Stephen in a blanket. Before the ambulance arrived, a police car was on scene. A lot of people question why a police car got there before an ambulance. Ambulances are always more short than police. Let's put it that way. And of course, police are going to attend. Dwayne's literally just said, "My friend's been stabbed," so obviously police are going to attend this. However, no emergency first aid was administered by these officers, along with no written logs of their surroundings, no witness statements, nothing. I can't imagine exactly what they were doing in this moment. Were they just hanging around, chatting? Were they not immediately concerned about the sheer amount of blood that was pouring out of this young man? It's infuriating to think that they could have done something, anything, to try and help him. Perhaps this story could have been different if they'd have even tried, but we'll get more onto police negligence later. In some articles I found that these officers weren't remotely first aid trained, but frankly that makes no difference to me. You don't need to be first aid trained to understand that blood should remain inside your body and that if you lose too much of it, you will die. You only need to fall over and hurt your knee to know you physically need to apply pressure to it, right? And yes, they're not medical professionals. They shouldn't know how to save a life, but they should have human instinct to help someone who is suffering. A couple that was passing by actually stopped to help as much as they could. They comforted Stephen, held his hand, and reassured him and told him that he was loved. And thank God that someone showed this boy an ounce of humanity before he passed. It wasn't long before the ambulance arrived and Stephen was taken to Brooke General Hospital, but by 11:05 p.m. he was pronounced dead upon arrival. The fact that this was such a cold, random attack is so bizarre. Like, the chances of just going out and getting stabbed are really slim. But then again, I'm white, so maybe that's my white privilege, not understanding the real risks. But it seems random even in this. Like, Stephen didn't do anything to provoke this gang. He was just in the right place at the wrong time. Police attended the hospital, obviously to take a statement from Dwayne, but despite Dwayne telling the entire truth, they didn't buy a word of it. The police were hostile towards Dwayne and were convinced that the pair were actually in a gang themselves. They were trying to convince Dwayne, or at least get the information out of him, that this was actually a result of gang-on-gang violence. And Dwayne was trying so hard to remain calm and tell the police what had happened, but we have to remember that he's also 18 years old and has just witnessed his best friend be murdered because he's black. It was undeniably a racially motivated attack. And Dwayne himself is black, so he's probably completely horrified, but probably also feeling some survivor's guilt. But the officers thought Dwayne was being hysterical, and they even threatened to handcuff him. Police even made conscious decisions not to immediately search the area for any evidence, so not to disturb the local residents. Because how terribly inconvenient would that be? Because, you know, a whole street's one night of sleep is far more important than any vital evidence to, solve a racially motivated murder. Or even, to catch a local gang on the loose with a knife. Just to forewarn you, if you don't know this case, and you don't know what's about to come, the police work is only going to get worse from here on out. Stephen's mum was actually in Birmingham this night, but she rushed back as soon as she got the news. Heartbreaking doesn't even cover it. Like, I can't imagine getting the call that your son has been stabbed to death. Especially in a racially motivated attack. Nothing I will say in this case is ever going to do justice to the horror and the pain that this family faced. Stephen's parents, Neville and Doreen, go to identify Stephen's body. They arrive at the morgue and the person who's about to take them in coldly says to them, "We've got a boy in there. We don't know who he is, so if he's not your son, all well and good, we just need to know." Luckily, I've never had to identify a body or a loved one, but I'd like to think I'd have more decorum than that. Maybe calmly explaining the process, kind of forewarning them on how they may feel or what the experience is going to be like, or even what state the body's going to be in. But no, of course not. Of course they didn't get any ounce of humanity in this. Literally everyone who's meant to offer compassion to this family in this case just doesn't. Dwayne and Stephen's parents are completely mistreated from the very beginning of this case. Police eventually spoke to multiple witnesses who were able to give details on the gang, including which direction they ran off to that night. And multiple members of the public even provided names of the gang to the police. Included in these name drops were Neil Accourt and his brother Jamie Accourt, David Norris, Gary Dobson and Luke Knight. These men were known as a gang, notorious for racism and carrying around knives on the streets of Lewisham. All 5 of these named suspects were aged between 16 and 17 at the time, and multiple of them had already been in contact with the police with prior racially motivated attacks. The 6th and final suspect, or gang member, was not able to be named by anyone, but he was often referred to as the fair-haired one. These names were given to London Met Detective Christopher Budgeon and Benjamin Bullock, the detective inspector. But this, quite frankly, gold tip-off from multiple members of the public was just brushed under the rug. Some theorise it's because they took bribes from the boys' fathers, or some people just think, they just weren't fussed and didn't want to look into it. Regardless, it's appalling that these 5 weren't immediately looked into, and the public were doing everything they could to get these names in the police officers' laps. People were leaving post-it notes or letters on police cars and even posting anonymous letters through to police stations. Or they would literally, face-to-face, go into a station and request to speak to the inspector or an officer about it. So let's take a look into these 5 named suspects we have so far. Neil Accourt was 17 years old at the time and was seen as the leader of the group, with his younger 16-year-old brother Jamie being his left-hand man. Jamie had actually been kicked out of school at the age of 14 after kicking a black student down the stairs. as well as having a wrench in his bag that he intended to use on a black group of pupils after school. Strangely, I couldn't find anything about Neil being kicked out of school, which I thought was odd considering he was the leader of the gang. I feel like the leaders usually have been in the most trouble prior, let's say. David Norris, who was 16 at the time, had a bit more of a luxurious lifestyle. After all, his father was a drug dealer and a drug gang leader, apparently, so he had a lot of cash to burn, let's say. His father had a reputation of being like the godfather of Lewisham, so if that title itself isn't going to give a gang member a sense of protection and entitlement, I don't know what is. David had also been kicked out of school at 14 years old for violent behaviour, though that's pretty much the extent that I could find out about this. Whether it was just general violent behaviour, or whether it was like specific racist attacks, I'm not sure. Gary Dobson was 17 years old at the time, but his father was a police officer. But that didn't stop Gary being linked to a racially motivated attack earlier on that year. Oh no. The victim had actually been stabbed earlier that year and miraculously survived. And because this victim survived, they actually identified Gary as being part of the gang that attacked him. But this was later dropped due to lack of evidence. This is one of those cases where because there is a gang involved, there are multiple victims across multiple years. I would love to go into depth on each and every victim who ever suffered abuse from this gang, but we just don't have time to cover that today. Or if I did cover it, I wouldn't be able to go into as much depth that would provide them the justice they deserve or the honour of their story. Luke Knight, our fifth suspect, was 16 years old at the time and was a little quieter than the others. He just seemed to kind of latch on to the gang and not really have his own voice or do much of his own accord. These 5 suspects were placed under surveillance by Met Police. And this could be okay if it was done correctly, however, it wasn't. Because not only did they take their sweet time setting up, they actually had an external photographer who wasn't part of the police survey this lot. The photographer would hang around this local spot that the gang would frequently visit, in just hopes that he would see something. And they actually did witness something. Neil and Jamie Accourt were witnessed carrying massive bin bags full to the brim, putting them in cars, transporting them around suspiciously over the course of a few days. And it probably won't come as a surprise to us that it's probably evidence they're trying to get rid of at this point. And any evidence they did get rid of would have been absolutely vital to this case. But because this was a photographer witnessing this in the 90s and not a police officer right there and then, by the time this information and the images were provided back to the police, it was too late. Those bags of evidence were already gone. Police begin to question Stephen's parents on Stephen's character. They ask about gangs. Was he in a gang? Had his behaviour changed recently at all? And Stephen's parents outwardly said it felt like they were trying to see if Stephen provoked them in any way. Almost like the police just can't fathom that Stephen did nothing wrong, that this was totally racially motivated. And on the 4th of May 1993, Stephen's parents actually held a press conference expressing their frustration on how the case was being handled and how the suspects had been named but nothing was being done. And they're right, because it was so frustrating to know that the police had the information on the suspects within days. Like within 48 hours, multiple people had named these suspects, and yet there was no arrest. And the fact that they even had to reach to this point to publicly be like, yeah, they're not doing anything, is awful. No parent should ever have to sit there and fight for help to arrest suspects of their child's murder. But this press release did have an impact on the public, or at least the decent members of society that could clearly see the racism that was involved in this case. But not only the general public, no. Nelson Mandela. Yep, Nelson Mandela met Stephen's parents, where they discussed the case and the tragic loss of their son. And Nelson Mandela actually released a statement to say it's obvious that black lives are cheap here in the UK. Now clearly, it's not exactly a good look for the London Met if the President of South Africa at the time is releasing a statement to say that, yeah, this is being handled with racism. And seemingly it did kickstart them into actually trying to do something. 2 weeks after Stephen's murder, 3 suspects were arrested. Gary Dobson and Jamie and Neil Accourt. David Norris turned himself in just a few days later. And finally, the 5th suspect, Luke Knight, was arrested 1 month later. Now you may think 2 weeks is quite a quick turnaround for an arrest. But when you consider the fact that police had all these suspects named within 48 hours by multiple witnesses, and just general members of the public who are like, yeah, I think this gang did it. Yeah, 2 weeks isn't good enough. And that's 2 weeks to arrest the first 3, then a further 3 days for the next one, and then a month for the next one. Unsurprisingly, all of these boys gave no comment in their interviews. and police raided their homes in hopes to find any evidence, but it was looking bleak. But in a witness lineup, multiple witnesses who were there and witnessed the attack, including Dwayne, were actually able to identify some of these suspects. So with this being kind of their main hope, Neil Accord was the first to be charged. Luke Knight was the second suspect to be charged. And if you don't know this story, you might be thinking, yes, they did it. You know, within a couple of months, they are all charged. But sadly, you'd be wrong, as the charges were later dropped to insufficient evidence and the case went cold. Stephen's parents actually decided to bury Stephen in Jamaica next to his great-grandmother, in fear that his grave wouldn't be respected or would be defaced by gangs in London. And the fact that they even had to think of that, along with, having to actually bury their son, is sad, but they were right. Because a memorial plaque lays on the street of West Hall Road in honour of Stephen where he died, and this plaque had been defaced multiple times. Protests began to hit the streets in outrage of Stephen's case and his murder, as Stephen's family fought so hard for justice. But after a year, they realised that they probably weren't going to get that from the police, so they decided to go through a private investigator. And the public grouped together to help raise funds for this, for the Lawrence family. Which is really reassuring that even in the 90s, there were good, honest people out there who could see the injustice that was occurring, and they wanted an answer for this family. So the private investigation was underway to try and bring these boys to trial. But frustratingly, Jamie Accord and David Norris were dropped prior to the trial even beginning due to insufficient evidence. And in April 1996, the 3 remaining suspects were taken to trial. The main evidence against taking these boys to trial was the fact that Dwayne was able to pick them out in a suspect lineup. But the court found Dwayne to be an unreliable source. They cross-examined him and found that his statements weren't matching up, and this was 3 years after the attack. So of course some minor details are going to be different. Because of this, the identification in the lineup was revoked as evidence, and the prosecution collapsed again with insufficient evidence, and all 3 boys were acquitted. And one really sad fact, along with everything else we've already uncovered, is that double jeopardy in the UK at the time meant that these boys could not be trialled for Stephen's murder again. This private investigation was literally their last hope. This case is just a constant barrage of this family being let down again and again by organisation and laws that are meant to be there to protect them. In fact, it wasn't until February 1997 where it was actually announced that this attack was racially motivated. This was announced following an inquest into Stephen's murder. Following this inquest, the Daily Mail released an article on their front page where the headline read, "Murderers." So 4 years after the murder of Stephen, the Daily Mail released this on their frontline paper, saying, "The Mail accuses these men of murdering. If we are wrong, let them sue us." This was massive. Huge even. This is a main newspaper for England, and they've just gone out of their way to throw their neck on the line to call these boys murderers when there isn't even a conviction. And the headline proves how huge they knew this was in the first place, because these men could literally sue them for defamation of character, but these men never did sue them for defamation. What does that tell us? Because I think if you were innocent and, the Daily Mail released an article saying that you were a murderer despite any evidence, you would definitely sue, because you could make bank on that. But the fact that they don't even bother just says to me that they just want to keep out of sight. I do have to say, this is probably the most truthful article the Daily Mail has ever released. I'm not a fan of newspapers particularly, I think they're often quite biased. But this article gets the seal of approval, and it took some balls. It's quite literally the definition of fuck around and find out. In 1997, despite the law of double jeopardy meaning that they literally can't take these boys to trial again, police actually planted cameras and microphones in Gary Dobson's house to see if they could catch the gang talking about the murder of Stephen. Unsurprisingly, given the fact that it was years after Stephen's death, they never mentioned Stephen specifically. But the police did discover that the group often liked to discuss how they would torture and murder black community members and officers. This group is just vile. In 1997, another inquiry was held, and this was named the McCafferson Report, titled after Sir William McCafferson, a member of the High Court Justice. The suspects attended the public inquiry in court, and people even threw bottles at them as they left the court that day. But these 5 men held like an arrogance about them. It screams to me like, you know we did this, but you can't pin it on us, and there's nothing you can do about it. And they must have been feeling invincible at this point, surely, because everyone knew they did it. But due to the terrible policing that happened at the beginning of this case, there wasn't any evidence to prove it, or at least not enough evidence to actually convict them. The McCafferson report took over 18 months to complete, and in February 1999 over 350 pages were released. And in this report, the police were straight up called out for their incompetency and institutional racism. This report literally shaped the definition of institutional racism in the UK. So the statement they released said, "Institutional racism is a collective failure of an organisation to provide appropriate and professional service to people because of their colour, race, culture, or ethnic origin. It is seen in processes, attitudes, and behaviour, which amount to discrimination through unwilling prejudice, ignorance, thoughtlessness, and racial stereotyping, which disadvantages ethnic minority people." Which, pretty much hits it nail on the head. In the background of this case, at the time of the McCaffrey report being released, it was actually being looked into further by forensic scientists. As since the murder had taken place, DNA profiling had developed fast, and they were able to actually find a speck of blood on Gary Dobson's jacket, and the DNA profile matched Stephen Lawrence. Not only this, but a pair of jeans recovered actually contained 2 hairs which also belonged to Stephen. And as damning as this evidence was, and as much as it probably felt like an absolute breakthrough, they couldn't do anything because of the double jeopardy law. Even despite the fact they have new evidence to bring to the case, they couldn't take them to trial again. That was until 2005, because in 2005 this law was changed. As part of the findings on the Stephen Lawrence case, the McCaffrey report had actually recommended that the rule against double jeopardy should be repealed in murder cases, and that it should be possible to subject an acquitted murderer for a second trial if fresh and viable new evidence is later found, which is huge. The double jeopardy law was over 800 years old at this point. And to be honest, I think laws should probably have a more regular review than 800 years, because I'd like to think that we're more aware of right and wrong from 800 years ago, or maybe things have changed that need tweaking in the last 800 years, perhaps. So with this change in law and the new evidence against Gary Dobson and David Norris, in 2006 the case was reopened, and in 2010 police were on the lookout for the pair, as they could now formally connect them to Stephen's murder. I don't know why it took a further 4 years after reopening the case, or 5 years after the law changing, for them to actually be able to arrest the pair. Everywhere I looked seemed to kind of gloss over that fact that, 2005 the law changes, but 2010 they actually start looking for this pair that they have new evidence on. I don't know. But we can hazard a guess as to why it took so long. But luckily these two were not hard to find, because in 2010 Gary Dobson was actually in prison for dealing and smuggling drugs as well as helping immigrants cross the border, which might sound crazy for someone who is blatantly racist. However, we can only imagine what he was doing to these immigrants once they crossed the border. He was probably using them to smuggle drugs. County lines is a massive thing in the UK, especially London. David Norris, on the other hand, was living above a pub in Greenwich. The pair were arrested in 2010, and the trial began on the 14th of November 2011. And remember that Stephen was murdered in 1993. So this is over 17 years from the murder by now. That is grueling for the family, but horrifying that it actually took a change in the law for something to be done. And at this point, we don't know which specific member of the gang actually stabbed Stephen, but we don't need to know, because due to the nature of the case, they were all culpable for murder, and if they were found guilty, they would share an equal sentencing. This trial was a little bit of a shit show. The prosecution and defendants went back and forth about this jacket that had a speck of blood on it, with the defendant's argument being that Gary Dobson would never be seen dead wearing that jacket, because it's not his usual style. Give me a break. But Gary Dobson wasn't the smartest, let's say, and he actually managed to incriminate himself quite a bit. The alibi that Gary was providing this day in court contradicted the alibi that he originally gave police back in 1993. Originally, Gary had told the police that he'd been at home with his family all evening, and he'd just been upstairs in his room listening to music, and that he hadn't heard of Stephen's murder till the next day when he read it in the newspaper. Does Gary strike you as a newspaper reading type? Not to stereotype, but I think that may have been an even bigger lie than saying he was at home. But in court, during the trial in 2011, Gary was saying that he actually was at Neil and Jamie's house that evening. He said he'd nipped over to borrow a CD, when a friend, Matthew White, had burst into the house to say Stephen had been stabbed down the road. So yes, it's 17 years after the murder, and of course some memories are going to be hazy and slightly differ. However, that's quite a difference. And if you were being accused of murder, you would remember an alibi you were giving. You would specifically try your hardest to remember exactly where you were to keep yourself clean. And David Norris actually claimed a similar alibi. He said that he would often visit the Court brothers late at night. But on that night, he came home early because it was a school night. But as we know, David got kicked out of school at 14 years old. So I'm not too sure what he was doing that evening to prepare himself for the next day. Because quite frankly, he wasn't going to school. The defence were also clutching at straws by trying to run with the theory that the jacket had been contaminated with Stephen's blood whilst in police custody. But luckily, the prosecution had a forensic scientist who was able to disprove this theory. Because the way that the blood was entrapped in the fibres of the jacket, it only would have been able to get there when it was fresh and wet, making the chances of contamination in police custody after the murder of Stephen pretty much near impossible. On the 3rd of January 2012, the jury returned for a verdict, where they unanimously found Gary Dobson and David Norris guilty of Stephen's murder. Gary was sentenced to 15 years and 2 months, as opposed to David, who was sentenced to 14 years and 3 months. That is the most pathetic sentencing for murder I have ever heard. And where we are in 2024, that means they've nearly served all their time. Because in 2 years, these men will be free. The reason their sentences were so short is because they were trialled as juveniles, because at the time of the murder they were under 18. Cases like this make me think that the UK justice system needs to take more of an American approach sometimes. Because in my head, they are adults at the time of trial, so therefore you should treat them as such. It's not like they were 12 years old at the time of the murder, they were like 16, 17. That's so close to being an adult. I understand the line is there for a reason. But also, this is years later. It's not like they were being trialled when they just freshly turned 18 or 19, right? This is 17 years later. They absolutely should have been trialled as adults. Of course, some people completely agree with the juvenile sentencing because they weren't adults at the time of the murder. But it's not like this was a one-off attack for a lot of the members involved. Every suspect continues to show racist attacks, racist behaviour, and just violence in general. So this was less of a teenage impulsive moment or attack. This was a complete racist overview of the world. And they will continue to offend as such in the future. In June 2023, last year, 30 years later, the BBC reported a re-examination of Stephen's case. And this actually resulted in the police naming the 6th suspect who was never released to the public prior. This is the one that we earlier referred to as the fair-haired one. And it's a name that we've already come across in this case. Matthew White. This means that during the trial in 2014, Gary actually dropped Matthew's name in court, and we as the public had no idea that he was going to be the 6th member of the gang. And I say we as the public because the police did know Matthew was the 6th suspect. Because in 2013, Matthew was arrested for suspicion in connection to Stephen's murder, but was later released due to insufficient evidence. But even more shockingly to that, in 1993, Matthew's stepfather came to the police and told them he thinks that his stepson is involved in this murder. But shock horror, nothing was done. But in 2020, Matthew died of a drug overdose at just the age of 50, meaning he never had to face the consequences of what he did that night. And at this point in the episode, I would love to turn around and say that Matthew was the only one to get away with this murder. But sadly not. But to this day, Gary Dobson and David Norris were the only two held accountable, and their sentences are very nearly up. In the year 2000, the Lawrence family were paid £320,000 by the Met Police for the failings found in their son's case. Doreen and Neville actually ended up divorcing because of the stress that this caused them. The constant appeals, the racism that they received from the Metropolitan Police just broke down their relationship and they couldn't take it anymore. Neville moved back to Jamaica and Doreen stayed in London. And in 2013, she was actually granted a seat in the House of Lords. Stephen's parents, phenomenal throughout this case. They continued to fight, and despite divorcing and the amount of sheer pressure and stress and heartbreak, they always had a united front for their son. And they continued to fight for the injustice and racism in today's society. And despite the fact that this case has given them over 30 years of heartbreak, they are sure that Stephen would be proud of the legacy that he left behind. In 2006, Dwayne Brooks actually tried to sue Metropolitan Police for their racist treatment to him throughout the case. Dwayne actually ended up requiring psychiatric care following all of this treatment. The police were not found liable for Dwayne's psychiatric health. However, he did receive a settlement of £100,000 for the racist treatment. In 2019, annual Stephen Lawrence Day was announced by then Prime Minister Theresa May, and it's something that's commemorated every year in April. And I wanted to cover this case because it's coming up to 31 years since Stephen's murder, where, just months ago information was still coming out on this case. This case is one of the biggest in the UK, one of the most historic. Not only because of the horrific nature of the attack, or the inexcusable institutional racism of the Metropolitan Police throughout this case, but because this case completely changed the course of the UK. We are nowhere where we need to be for the equality of black people, people of colour and ethnic minority groups. And if you look back from now to 30 years ago, see how much we've opened our eyes to say yes. The Met is institutionally racist. Who knows, in another 5 to 10 years, we may be looking back on things that are happening now and be like, how were we so blind? We have to remember that this case changed a law that was over 800 years old. That's massive. But despite the triumphs and the revelations that this case did bring us, nothing can take away the pain that the Lawrence family faced over the last 30 years. And the UK is still heartbroken for the Lawrence family. Nothing we can ever say is ever going to provide any reassurance or comfort for them, or even remotely touch on an apology. The Met have since said that their handling of this case, the racism involved, the mishandling of information, was significant and regrettable. I mean, yeah, that doesn't even touch on how bad it was, but I guess that's better than nothing. And it's important to bring this case back round to the heart of it, which is Stephen. Stephen was a young man with huge ambitions who was just starting his life. He was more than just a black teenager that was stabbed on the streets of London. And I hope that every April, the UK reflects on the murder of Stephen. And I hope that we reflect where we are and where we need to be, and what we need to do to get where we need to be. This case helped us improve the treatment of black people and ethnic minorities in the UK, but there's still so much more that needs to be done. Because this case isn't the only one of its kind. There are countless cases here in the UK that were treated with the same racism and lack of humanity. A lot of these surrounding the same time as Stephen's murder as well. But the involvement of the Daily Mail and the Macaffison report truly made this case as famous as it is. Despite all the hard work, only 2 members were convicted, and that is just not good enough. And that's the whole point of revisiting cases like this. History is designed to be taught so that we don't repeat our actions and so that we learn from our mistakes. It's our responsibility to educate ourselves on the misjustice that happens to black people and ethnic minorities here in the UK. Racism still is a huge part of our society and integrates in these people's daily lives. And it's not their job to educate us. It's our job to educate ourselves and make a difference. So there we have it, guys. That was the tragic case of Stephen Lawrence. Thank you for making it to the end of the video of a really long, harrowing story that still feels somehow unfinished. Take some time for yourself today, go drink some water and do something nice and chill. As always, thank you for the support. My DMs have been absolutely flooded with messages of just support and love and appreciation from you guys, and I'm so very grateful. YouTube feels like a bit of a safe space for me, honestly. I get a lot of hate on TikTok, sometimes Instagram, but YouTube, you guys feel safe to me. You feel like a little home base that I can always come back to and feel supported. If you are listening on Spotify, please leave a review. And if you are watching on YouTube, please drop a comment down below. What did you think of today's case? What case do you want me to cover next? Comment below and have your say, interact with me. I always try my best to reply to every comment if I can. As always, stay safe and I'll see you next time. Bye.